Hi, everyone. I hope you're doing well. Thanks for your patience as I catch up on everything and try to get all these videos and assignments and everything up. Um, so, I wanted to just sort of wrap up this assignment you did about which genes would you change. Um, Super interesting. This makes for a really good in class discussion and sort of some group work. But, anyways, it is what it is. So, I asked you to fill out the survey explaining which genes you would change if you could, and rating them on a scale of 0 to 10, and then providing some explanations. And generally, what I saw was that people really wanted to change genes that would really adversely affect somebody's quality of life. So, for most people, that was the terminal illness. But for some, it was also maybe like alcoholism if it runs in the family, and they've seen firsthand the effects that that can have on the quality of life of that person and those around them. For some, it was things like blindness or deafness, where the obviously the common perception is that would really adversely affect someone's quality of life. So those were the things that scored high, and the things that scored low were things like aesthetic traits. So let's actually go through them really quickly. Um, so these are the responses. 36 of you responded, and over in this left-hand corner, you'll see the trait, and then over here, you'll see sort of a distribution of what rating they gave. And so, if there's a lot on this right side, that means a lot of people would definitely change it. On the left side, it means a lot of people definitely would not. And then, you can see what's in the middle. So, alcoholism, a lot of people would change that. Autism, a lot of people would. Blindness, color blindness, a little bit less so, but still. Deafness, almost, or vast majority. Down syndrome, dyslexia. So those all were got pretty high responses. And then eye color, gender were low. So most people would not change those things, especially gender. Very few people put that. Um, Glasses are sort of evenly distributed. Handedness, height, no. Sexuality was, and skin color were no. And then terminal early childhood disease was yes. And I looked at some of the responses. A lot of the ones who said 0 for this basically said that it's because um, they don't feel like they should change any genes. That if that's the way a child is going to be born, that's the way a child's going to be born. So let's talk about some of these things. I may have to make a couple of videos to fit it in, but let's talk about it. Let's talk about those who said that they would change some of these earlier traits: deafness, blindness, autism, Down syndrome. Um, these are traits that obviously make things a little more complicated, makes life, because that person doesn't fit into the norm. There's extra accommodations or extra things you need to account for. That's certainly all true. I once took for about a year. I took an ASL, American Sign Language class, and the class was taught by a woman who was born hearing, but born to deaf parents. So her parents had become deaf later in life. They weren't genetically born deaf. So she was genetically born hearing, but because her parents were already deaf at that point, ASL was her first language, and English was actually her second language. So she taught the class, and of course this is her perspective, and every community has diverse perspectives, but she was saying that within the deaf community, there's a lot of people who consider being deaf a blessing, almost, like someone would say, a cultural part of their culture. It's a cultural trait, and so for someone, and it, of course, there's some things that come along with that make things difficult, but there's also a lot of beautiful things that come along with deafness, um, and more than that, it is part of who that person is. And so, difficult or not, it's who they are, and it has become part of their personality, and then it's part of the community culture. For someone to say that this is really tough and I would change that, or I wouldn't have that for my child, can almost be insulting, right? It's as if somebody says, like a lot of you put 0 for skin color, right? But as we mentioned in the last video with Gattaca, obviously having lighter skin um, has some advantages in our society because the society has a prejudice against dark skin. But if you were to say to someone, well, life is so hard with dark skin, genetically, I would change, you would say, hey, that's not right. You should change the perception of people. And so, similarly, within the deaf community, there's a similar response that why not just change things so that it's easier for deaf people, or there's more accepting, or there's more interaction, or more inclusion. Same thing with Down syndrome, same thing with autism. All these things can be difficult in some respects, but there's also a lot of positives that come out of it. And you can Google. We don't have, there's not a ton of time, but maybe I'll link it in the module. But there's videos of people who have these conditions that say it's wonderful and it's a blessing. I remember seeing an interview with a mom and a daughter where the daughter has Down syndrome, and she was saying that it's a wonderful gift in her life. So, sometimes from the outside, we can make judgments about these traits. But, from within the community, and again, there are diverse perspectives. Perhaps there are people who really did wish they didn't have these traits. But it's not universally accepted that these things are bad. So that's something to think about. There's also a clip from one of the X-Men movies, I forget which one, where there's a similar issue where a cure to mutantism is to the mutant gene is discovered, and there's big controversy within the mutant community about whether or not people should be getting this cure. For some mutants, their mutations really mean that they can't do things that they would like to do. But for a vast majority of mutants, they think it's an insult to think that other people think of their mutation as a disease that needs to be cured. If I can find that clip, I'll post it as well. So some of these other ones were very low gender. And it's interesting because I think the ones that were rated very low, either we sort of think of them as inconsequential, like eye color. But some of them were because people felt very strongly that we should not care about these things, or we should not have a bias towards these things. So gender, sexuality, and skin color, especially, I think people have strong feelings that, well, if you choose that means you're prejudiced or biased, and so have strong feelings about not choosing those. And then terminal early childhood disease. Now, I wanted to address, I guess this is the last thing, this thing about the perspective that I wouldn't change any genes. I would leave everything the way it's supposed to be. And not to say that that's a wrong response. It's a very natural one. But one thing which is interesting is, is that sometimes people say, well, if this is the way, for example, God intended it to be, then, I would leave it be. But who's to say that God also didn't intend us to get the technology to be able to fix that, right? Or what's the difference between, if your child is born with this disease, you're also not going to say, well, God intended it this way, just let them run the natural course, right? I mean, most people would intervene and would ask for treatment and really try to cure this child if they could. So I'm wondering what's the difference between doing that before the child is born or after the child is born, right? If you can cure the disease before the child is born, is that really different than curing it a month after they're born or 6 months after they're born? So it's just something to think about. And again, the argument about God's intentions, it tends to be really difficult because if you do believe in God, you don't know God's intentions, right? We're guessing at them, and because we interpret one thing as God's intentions, doesn't necessarily mean that that's correct, right? So again, the argument that, well, if God intended them to be that way, then they are that way. But but couldn't everything else also be God's intentions in terms of this technology we have, the ability to change things, to address it? So I'm not saying that that's wrong, but I think you have to take a little more comprehensive look at it and not just say these certain things are is God's intention, but not these other things. So so that's it. I will find those clips and also post it on here so that you can take a look at them. And then you can move on to the next assignment in the next video. Thank you so much.